Welcome to this very special live stream this month, and this is going to be focused on what we're calling hybrid people management and leading remote teams. A very, very warm welcome, depending on wherever you are on the planet. If you're in the Americas, good morning. Good afternoon for those of us here in Europe. I'm here based in London, also in the Middle East. Good evening, and also for those of you who've made it from Asia, then good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining the live stream. Actually, maybe what we should do as a very quick roll call is wherever you are dialing in from around the world, please do feel free to let us know where you're in. Give us a shout out to your location or to the organization that you work for. Again, a very, very warm welcome to the live stream this month. We're going to do this monthly. We were doing this bi-weekly, but I think it was just too much for us, probably too much for you. So every month we'll be doing these live streams. Again, this one is a very special one for us because we like to react to what we're seeing, hearing, learning from both from LinkedIn and both from our audience. So for those of you who don't know us, my name is Wayne Clark. I run an organization called the World Class Manager Organization, and we focus on building line management capability with managers all around the world. Our team is based here in the UK. We also have partnerships in Saudi Arabia, in South Africa, in Mongolia. A huge shout out to our Mongolian team as well. Awesome team. Also to Turkey and the Netherlands and also the US. So we work with our team all over the world, working on building essentially line management capability. And our focus has very much been how do we do that at scale? Lots of organizations, we work with lots of governments too. And a big part of what we wanted to do as part of these someone from South Carolina, good morning to you in Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. A big part of what we wanted to do is these live streams is to share with you some of the best practices and things that we keep finding out all around the world. So again, hugely practical. I'm a big fan of the data. I'm a big fan of the trends. I'm even a bigger fan of the practical how-to stuff. And everything we wanted to share with you as part of this is based on how-to practical things that we've learned from great managers, great leaders all around the world. Very short intro, and we're going to kick off. It's a very delicate intro. Usually we've got like big music, bass pumping, but much more delicate, probably because it's more of a delicate subject. We've also got a member of the team also on the line. So Rose from our team here in London is also on the line. So if you do have any questions, any suggestions, any things that you want to sort of comment on or connect with, please do feel free to use the various chat functions. I think we're live both on LinkedIn, and also there's a web link and probably YouTube as well, I believe, Facebook. So please do feel free to use whatever chat function you have. Just let us know and we can try and either deal with that live online and we'll deal with that towards the end of the session, or if we can't at the time to deal with that live, then we'll deal with it after the session. So again, we want to make this as interactive, as relaxed as possible. As we often say in the run up to these things, this is business casual. This is business casual attire only needed. Obviously, we prepare because we've got lots of stuff that we want to share with you. But I've got like actually, this is my notes. Look, there's my notes. Plain and simple, not very structured, probably against all sorts of best practice to do with how you should write notes for these things. But we want to try and keep this as human and as real and as sporadic and fresh as possible. So we've got 6 big things that I wanted to share with you, 6 practical how-tos based on everything that we found. So let's jump into it. In terms of an organization, if you're new to these live streams, as a super quick intro, 60 seconds, we've worked now with over 100,000 managers in more than 50 countries around the world. We run a program called the World Class Manager Program. So we like to think that we speak from a very much evidence base based on observing some of the best practices, best managers in action around the world. And as you can imagine, and I've personally worked now with over 1,000 different CEOs, if you picture 1,000 CEOs on a spectrum from the deeply empathic who want to hug you all day to the clinical psychopath, I'm just joking, on the other side of the scale. And there's a lot to learn from that entire spectrum of best practice of management and leadership behavior. So as much as we can try and cram in to the next half an hour or 40 minutes or so, we'll try and do that. And this is very much based on our evidence, not based on things that we think would be nice to just talk about. It's then crushed and mushed its way into a book called How to Become a World-Class Manager, which launched last year. So we've been around the world launching that. In the US, I was in New York. For those of you here from the US, actually, we launched it at the United Nations around sort of March time, April time 2023, and we've been doing that around the world, South Africa, the Middle East, and we're very excited because with our partners also in Saudi Arabia, we're going to launch an Arabic version of the book, which launches anytime now in the next couple of weeks. And we're delighted that the book is being published by Jarir Bookstore, which is arguably the best book publisher across the Middle East. So a very huge thank you to Jarir, and we're very much looking forward to getting started in the Middle East. You may be listening to this from a few different perspectives, right? So I wanted to zero in terms of what this all means practically for you as a manager. I'm assuming as a manager that you've got people in different locations. Presumably you're working in a hybrid nature in your team, in your organization. You've got people in the office, you've got people maybe at home, you've got people in lots of different locations around the place, maybe even around the world. And if you're listening to this from this perspective, then I wanted to make this as ultra valuable for you as possible with 6 specific things that we think work really effectively and we wanted to share with you. You may be thinking about this from a larger perspective where you may have a number of managers who are managing large and dispersed teams all over the place. So again, if this is you, then of course, we hope this is going to be of tremendous value to you as well. Also, I'd like to talk to the entrepreneur community because if you are growing a company, one of the hardest things that you will encounter as you're growing a business is, of course, building a great team. And increasingly, if you're building a startup, I would imagine that you're not building them probably in an office. Why would you do so? And then there's maybe a fourth group, which are those of you out there who are thinking about becoming managers and have a path towards being a leader one day. And I think not just talking to you about this because it's important right now because of the hybrid nature of how we work, but I think increasingly in terms of developing your own leadership capability, we think that this is going to be very useful for you. So if you're even an undergraduate planning to be a manager one day, we sort of joke and say, why would you do that? Managing people is insane, really. Why would you do it? But we think that, again, this will be really valuable for you and also for your journey as well. So welcome to this session called Hybrid People Management and Leading Remote Teams. Now, before we get into these 6 specific things, we'd looked at some of the headlines on this. I don't want to spend much time on this because we all agree that hybrid nature of working is kind of here to stay. There's no point rehashing the same old stuff that we see on LinkedIn all the time. So 3 super quick headlines. The Economist, which said actually early this year that the fight over remote working will heat up in 2024. Of course it will. Of course it is, and probably will continue to do so. The interesting thing that I was looking at here was looking at the commercial utilization occupancy rate. So if you look at 4 global centers, let's look at New York, let's look at London, let's look at Dubai, let's look at Singapore. And there is an interesting story to tell. Obviously, I'm no sort of commercial real estate expert. This is not our expertise, but just looking at the data that we can pull off as fresh as we can from an internet search, it does seem that there's quite a clear difference between what's going on east of the UK and west of the UK. It seems to be that in Europe and also in the US, the occupancy rates in commercial buildings seem to have stagnated and are still well below pre-pandemic levels, whereas the picture seems to be quite different in Dubai and quite different in Singapore. And I also know from our connections in both locations that things are different. So it feels like the commercial real estate world is much more tougher for those of us in the Western Hemisphere. And it's an interesting global split in terms of the trend. McKinsey & Company, again, they say that the future of working will be hybrid. No surprise. Again, we've seen this from all of the major thought leaders around the world. And then the final one from Harvard Business Review, which says that remote work isn't going away and executives know it. Whether they like it or not is a different thing, but I do think it faces, it makes the organization face some interesting challenges, partly for us, because as we go back in time, right, we say that, and as the run up to this, so if you saw any of the hype videos, and we produced quite a few, I think, but in the run up to this, one of the things that we talked about was that hybrid working was always a thing, right? It was always a thing. I don't know how old you are. I'm 48 years old. I'm getting on, but I began in the workplace in 1998. And interestingly, one of the first projects I worked for, they're now Deloitte. They were a different company, Arthur Andersen, now Deloitte. And one of the first research projects I was asked to work on was a video conferencing technology which sat on people's laptops, and it worked at 60 frames per second, which in 2024 is nothing given that we've got 4 and 8 and 12K. But 60 frames a second in 1998 was a big deal, right? And we were looking at the nature of video conferencing as a mechanism to empower hybrid teams. Now, this is, 26 years ago, we were looking at this technology, and we were learning from, at the time, some of the case studies from BP, which is one of the major oil and gas companies, who were using hybrid working technology in the early 90s, right? So this is like not new at all. Hybrid working has been around for a very, very long time. It became more as a thing, as we say, during the pandemic and during lockdown. for, of course, out of necessity, and it still is a thing, and it will probably never go back to how it was. One of the interesting arguments and conundrums that many organizations faced culturally was that a lot of people wanted to work in a hybrid way. They wanted to work in remote locations, work from home. But often those requests were denied by organizations. And then, of course, the pandemic came and organizations scrambled to be able to provide people with the technology and the ability to work from any location of their choice, and made a big noise about it. And then, in a way, for some organizations, the rug got pulled out from under people's feet, and people were demanded to come back into the office. People had moved hundreds of miles away, if not further, from their physical HQ, and we're now facing a different dilemma. And there is an interesting trust conundrum for many organizations in how that all happened. But again, too big, too complex. We don't have the time. We wanted to focus here on the how-tos. So there are 6, as I said, very specific things that we wanted to get into in this. And please feel free to submit any questions, thoughts. And Rose, who's live on the line, I hope she is. I can see her name here on the setup. So I think she is live on the line. So 6 things we wanted to focus on. And it was partly based on a very brief and very simple survey that we ran here on LinkedIn. And it was to ask the question, what is the top remote management challenge? And there were 4 options. One was communication breakdowns. Second one was tracking productivity. Third one was building team cohesion. And the fourth one was managing time zones. As you can see in the numbers here, there's a clear winner. That 59% said building team cohesion. So what I thought I would do for the purpose of the live stream was to share with you 3 things that we think work really effectively from looking at this from the perspective of managing remote teams, right? So you're a manager, you've got people in different locations, hybrid working nature. These are the top 3 things I wanted to focus on. We also ran another survey looking at this from the other perspective. So even though I might be a manager and I've got people in my team that I'm responsible for, I'm also reporting to someone else, and I might be working remotely. And of course, they've got the same challenge. So I wanted to look at this from 2 very different perspectives. And I think it's healthy because it's, a way of demonstrating empathy, right? We're all in a sort of sandwiched position if you're in a management role. Even though you may be a senior manager, a director, an executive of a company, we're still often in a difficult sandwich position. So we wanted to look at this from 2 very different perspectives. So we're going to share 3 things from what it means to look at managing teams, and 3 things that that people are telling us about how it might feel to be managed, and some of their big fears and concerns as well. First one I wanted to get into was looking at what we call this building team cohesion. So again, this was the highest scoring area, 59%. The interesting thing here is when we think about how do you build really effective teams, and if you go back in your experience, you may have been lucky enough to work with a manager who has built an exceptional team, or indeed you may have been in an organization where you built also an exceptional team. When you think of what goes into building an exceptional team, whether we're talking about the virtual world or the face-to-face in-person world, the same principles are at play. At the beginning of the lockdown, we were asked to do so many webinars with organizations talking about what great hybrid and great remote management looked like, that in a way we actually got sick of it in the end. I produced a load of free videos and we published them and put them out there for free because I was bored of doing it. But actually, if you looked at the principles at play of what a great manager was doing in the virtual world, surprise, surprise, they were exactly the same things that great managers were doing in the face-to-face in the physical world. We found that the managers who excelled and had great connections with their team before the pandemic didn't seem to encounter many of the problems that those managers who didn't have that type of behavior encountered when the change in the working nature, of course, that was forced upon us in a way, happened. So when we look at this, when we look at building team cohesion, and you may have a hint now for the thing I'm going to say, is that we talk about understanding each individual in the team. And this might sound straightforward and simple. Well, of course, Wayne, we work with our people all the time. I understand each individual in the team. Maybe that is the case. Maybe you're one of those exceptional few that have invested enough time and energy to truly understand the nature of the challenges, the hopes, dreams, and the ambitions of the individuals in the team. I would suspect that for the majority of managers we come across, and this is purely based on evidence, purely based on all the things that we found. And one of the things leading up to today that really sort of fascinated me, I hadn't seen this report before, I was sort of kicking myself that I hadn't seen it, was there was a report from 2015 produced by Gallup, and it was the state of the American workplace. I think you can Google and find the report. But it suggested, in the headline that I've seen anyway so far, that 10% of managers, according to their research, had the natural management, in a way, characteristics that would tend to mean that they would be great people managers. Whether or not this is 100% true, I've not seen the data. I don't know where the actual study was done and who was studied. So let's see. But it is an interesting number for the reason that of all of the things that we've learned over the last 8 years of running our world-class manager program, and as I said, now in 50 countries, 100,000 managers, we would kind of find a similar number. If we were to give a management development program to 100 people without the support of the L&D team and the OD team and the HR team and the HRBPs and the HR managers and the action learning sets and the coaches and all of the other periphery and necessary activity that goes into building a great learning culture, and just said to 100 managers, right, go for it, about 10% would probably finish ungoaded, unprompted any program. And we've also found that doesn't matter whether that's online, in the face-to-face world, of course, how many managers would do anything differently after going to a face-to-face management training program with no one else prompting them? You would find it would be around 10%, pretty much based on everything that we've seen. And we were doing this work long before we were doing this virtually. So when it comes to this, and the reason why I'm telling this long story is because if you think about how many managers will go out of their way to truly understand some of their individual team members in depth. What do they really want? What was their background like? What was their childhood like? Not saying that you should pry into people's personal stuff as much, of course, as people are willing to divulge, but the extent to which we can understand these individuals, not just from a work perspective, but all of them, their whole self, if you put it that way, is of course going to lend itself more towards building a better team cohesion. Why? Well, because we're able now, once we understand the individuals in the team, we're able to start to figure out, okay, this is where Mary really needs some support. And actually, it turns out that Jake is really good at doing this. I realized that Jake had some experience in doing this before. Maybe Jake can help Mary. Jake's particular strength or weakness, maybe let's look at it that way, is this, and Mary's got a strength that could help and complement. So in a way, what we can do is build and strengthen the team by building team cohesion, by better understanding the individuals in the team. This, for me, based on everything that we've seen, and I'm sure the rest of my team would agree, is probably one of the most effective mechanisms. It should cost you like $0, £0, €0, 0 dirhams, right, in order to affect this change, because it's all to do with building and understanding the nature of the relationship with the individuals in the team. So the first one we talk about is building team cohesion. For each one of these 6, I could probably talk comfortably for an hour, because there is so much we would love to share with you in terms of our research as well, but we don't have that time. So let's move on to number 2. So number 2 is looking at what we call communication breakdowns. Now, again, every single organization we've worked with in every country on the planet pretty much complains that communications is a challenge. We're yet to come across an organization anywhere in the world who says, you know what, communications is good. We're good. It works. Yeah, fine. No one has any issue with it. If we ask people, do we think communication should be improved? People say, no, it's fantastic. You don't find organizations like this. And I've tested this to the nth degree by finding the company who had the highest they had the highest employee engagement survey scores of any organization we've ever looked at. And we've looked at about 4,000 different organizations of data. I met the CEO who had scores that looked like a cult in the organization. If you looked like, if you wanted to get any organization to any place ever, you'd want to get every company to where his organization is at. It's an exceptional score, the best I'd ever found. And even in that company, he tells me that he's got some communication problems. It's a liberation moment. It's a liberation moment, especially if you're in communications. Why? Because what it means is we can't solve, in essence, the communication challenge for the organization. But what we do have a chance of solving is the individual perception of communications in the team. And that really, for most people, is kind of all that matters. If your team believe that communications is good and improving, you're in a great space. How do you do that? Well, we know that there are 3 key questions. I talk about this all the time, and I'll cover it again because I think it's important. First question is, what do you want to know about? So let's conduct a very simple communications audit. What do you want to know about? How often? How can I get that information to you? And it might be that you talk to, again, let's talk to Jake in the team. What do you want to know about, Jake? I really want to understand a bit more about the strategic direction of the company. How often? Every sort of 2-3 months would be great. How could we do that? Over a coffee would be fantastic. Excellent. Maybe I'll talk to Mary. What do you want to know about Mary? I want to know the numbers. I want to know how we're doing on a regular basis, like every other week. And I want an Excel file. That's good for me. Anything else? No, I'm good. If I deliver what Mary and what Jake want, and then I ask them the question, do you believe that communications is good? Of course, they're going to say yes, because their individual preferences for improved communications have now been met. I know I'm simplifying this. The world doesn't work in such a simple way, but just to illustrate the point. So when we talk about this in terms of our how-to, right, when we talk about this challenge of communication breakdowns, the one thing that I would ask managers to do, you may have already tried this, but this is what we would say, is try and script out, let's say 3 months. If that's too much of a stretch, try with initially a month. script out the next month in the life of your team in a way like a sequence of communications and say, right, what communications are necessary at what point? Now, in order to create that plan, that communications plan, you're going to need to start to talk to the team and find out a bit more about what it is that might need to be on that plan. Some of the stuff they tell you is going to need to go in there. Plus, remember, you've got a bunch of superiors, I would imagine, or more senior people to you in the organization, or executives, or shareholders, or stakeholders, or external partners, or key customers, or key clients that will have also a desire for what should be in that communication plan. If we're to be hyper effective as a manager, we're serving and solving challenges for multiple different stakeholder groups, more senior, more junior, peer level, internal, external, all sorts. How do we best do that? A clear way to do it is to create a very clear communications, in a way, plan. I wouldn't say strategy, it's too lofty. A communications plan of what stuff needs to be shared, with who, by which mechanism, and in a way, what you then also want to build in, as I would build in a test question of what's the evidence to suggest that that thing's actually worked. And there's a great saying in NLP. I'm not an NLP person, but I read this saying and I loved it. It said that you can, I don't know, the measurement of your communication is in the response it elicits. It's something like that. Any NLP person on the line will, I'm sure, correct me. But I love this statement because, again, you can't really test whether it's been effective to see whether it has been until it actually has been. So when we think about that, create a very clear communication plan for the month, key messages, key channels, key frequencies, take the input from the team and other key internal stakeholders or external stakeholders and use it to build that plan. Run it for a month, gauge it. Ask the team members after the month, do you feel like communications is good? Do you feel like it's improving? If there was a previous breakdown, do a diagnostic on it. What was it that caused you to say that? How can we fix that? Improve it month 2. Do people feel it's fixed? If so, great. And there is probably, this is for me is one of the most brilliant and free and quick wins that we could probably look for in any organizational change. If we're trying to get people to change their perception of how the culture is and how it feels to work here, the extent to which I feel like communications is improving has a huge impact in terms of how I feel about the organization overall. So when it comes to looking at communication breakdowns, I think this is a key way to really go after the problem and try and diagnose it and solve it rapidly. Final one on this area, when we look at these three, is looking at what we call tracking productivity. So it was 16%, I think I can see on the screen, 16% of the people who responded to the survey said actually this was the key issue when it came to looking at remote people management or hybrid people management. And this was an interesting one for us because when we look at the learning process, and I'm kind of biased because I began my career working in looking at organizational learning, looking at team-based learning. And one of the things that we recognized, I'm going to sound very old, back in the late 90s, was that we were looking at the extent to which organizations are learning organizations. We were promised, for those of us old enough, that the era of the learning organization was upon us. All would be solved in terms of organizational learning. Did it get solved? Probably not. We're still working at it. But in 2024, we recognize that this is still a significant challenge. Interesting, but let's zero it in on you and I. We work in the same team. Let's say you're my line manager. When we look at this, how often might we have a consistent or a regular learning review? And if you've never come across the terminology before, essentially what we're doing is we're asking 4 very, very simple questions. And I love these questions. They're after action learning review questions. Super simple. What was supposed to happen? Number 1. What actually happened? Number 2. Why was there a difference in between 1 or 2, good or bad? Doesn't matter. Why was there a difference? And number 4, what can we do differently next time? What was supposed to happen? What actually happened? Why was there a difference in between those first 2? And what can we do differently next time? 4 really powerful, super simple questions that we can run on a regular basis. My team, if you talk to the team, probably dislike this because I will call a very quick learning review at all sorts of times. I'm an absolute addict for it. I actually called a conversation this morning at 9 o'clock for 15 minutes because I just wanted to have a very quick learning review of where we were at on something, because I feel like working in a remote way as we do as a team, it's really important to try and galvanize these learnings. We cover so much ground as a small but hyper effective global team that we're often guilty of losing these learnings on a regular basis. The reason why I think this is a great way in to track productivity is because as a manager and as a team member, you feel watched, you could feel micromanaged if your manager is having a conversation with you about tracking productivity. Of course, that's not the smartest way to do it. If you could have a conversation with a team member on a regular basis about key learnings, what's working, what's not working, how can we review this, it would be a much more evolved and probably sympathetic way to open up a conversation in terms of productivity also for us as a manager to be able to understand what might be driving the breakthroughs or the breakdowns, and then what we can do about it in terms of improving productivity. Now, of course, let's face it, all of the activity we're talking about, that I'm talking about here, with learning, with management, with culture, with engagement, that we talk about with employee experience, that we talk about with customer experience, all of it is, of course, for one thing, right? Which for most commercial organizations is to maximize shareholder return. We're not, blind to the fact that this exists. If you're working in the public sector and you're a publicly funded organization, all of this, of course, is to ensure that you're utilizing public money in the most effective way possible to deliver a great result for the public or for society, or if it's an NGO or a charitable organization, right? So we recognize that all of this activity is about productivity. Of course it is. We're not ignorant of that. The key way to do it, though, I think is much more effective by approaching it through the learning route, because it means that we can have a more valuable conversation. And actually, if you're really interested in process improvement, it starts to unpick some of the things that we can then change, that of course then change the outcomes. So those were the three things when we look at the sort of managing teams point of view. And I wanted to look at this from the other perspective. So the other survey was looking at the question of being managed remotely. What are the key challenges? And again, I thought this is quite telling that 2 came out as clear front runners. So 38% said lack of clear direction, 38% said limited career visibility, and then 13% talked about isolation and loneliness as being the key issue. And there was, because work-life balance was 10%. Now, again, like the first one, I wanted to concentrate on these first 3, and we can get into this. Now, when we talk about this first one of called limited career visibility, I mean, this is an interesting one, again, in terms of if you took an average number, I'm not saying average, if you took a random sample of, I don't know, 50 or 100 employees in an organization and asked them the question, when did you last have a really good check-in when it came to a career development conversation with a line manager? Now, you may be in the lucky minority that you're having a very structured conversation with a line manager about development, about your career on a regular basis. If you are, excellent. Name and fame whoever that manager is in the chat, and we'll try and shine some spotlight on them, right? Because this is more rare than it is common. So when we talk about these regular career development check-ins, we think that this is one of the most important things. Now, this isn't a replacement for having a very structured appraisal conversation, development planning, career planning conversation. What we're talking about here, and certainly something which goes to one of the last points we'll talk about with isolation and loneliness, is something that feels a bit more sporadic. And it feels like, again, the extent to which you understand the individuals in the team is probably going to give you a clue and a cue of when this type of conversation would be a smart one to have. For some people, they don't have, let's say they don't have any ambition. They're quite happy to do a great job and do the job that they're doing, in which case they're kind of okay. They're content in what they're doing. For other people, they're much more ambitious, and they probably need this, especially if we're worried about hanging on to really great talent in the organization, that we probably want to up the frequency and, of course, the quality of these regular check-ins in terms of career development. It can feel tremendously isolating being in a remote location, not interacting very much with people in the office. And even when you are in the office, to what extent do you know some of those individuals, because you haven't had an opportunity to build those social networks. So having, being remote can tremendously impact in terms of the career visibility. Now, this is where this becomes a little bit not confrontational, maybe a bit contentious is a better word to use for us as people managers. Now, when I go to university, I lecture at City University. I'm there next week, I think, at City University Bayes Business School. So I lecture to undergraduates, to master's students, and also I've done the MBA program also here in London and also in Dubai. When I talk with those that are about to go into the workplace, I talk to them about what I consider to be the dream manager, right? Not the dreamy manager, but the dream manager from many perspectives is looking at 2 things. When we look at great management, and if you were going to choose a great manager to work for, you probably want them to sort of exhibit a lot of different behaviors, but let's focus on 2. One is that they are well networked in the organization from a people development point of view. It's very unlikely that an individual who's poorly networked as a manager is going to be able to open up development opportunities for you across the enterprise, across the organization, if they're poorly networked themselves, right? It's kind of impossible for them to do that unless you've got this exceptional HR, L&D, OD team that are making these proactive plays into your development conversations, which in most organizations, they've been unbelievably resource constrained and are being scaled back because of cost implication. So let's assume that the manager isn't the best at doing that. It's going to be hard to access opportunities across the organization. The second big thing is that the manager then understands you as an individual and takes time to do that, as we've just talked about. Now, this is the key. This is the key confrontational thing, I think, here for us as managers, is to what extent do we then build our own internal networks to make sure that we can create, proactively create development opportunities for the individuals in our teams. It might be that you're in an organization which is tremendously resource constrained, that, there might not be any money to spend on training programs, and there might not be training and development budgets. That might be quite impossible for you to agree, write a business case for, and get agreed. In which case, it doesn't mean that the ambitions of the team then stop, right? Of course, that's not the case. The ambitions of the team are always there. The ambitions of the individual are always there. How can we make sure that we're opening up enough development opportunities as possible? Why is this important? Well, according to what we found from our data of looking at 15,500 managers across the 100,000 who've been through our program, 50% of the organization will leave because they don't feel grown and developed. 50%, it's a huge number. So regular, what I would call check-ins to solve this, what we would call limited career visibility problem, is massive. The challenge for us as managers is how well do we also understand the organization in order to try and solve some of these issues. The second one is then looking at what we would call the clarity of direction. And again, this in a way challenges us as managers in a similar way to the point I've just covered. The key here is that we would want our managers to play a proactive role in not just repeating organizational strategy and the direction that the organization or the team or the department are going, but that they would actually understand it well enough to be able to, in a way, create a conversation with me as the most junior person in the company that makes sense to me, point A. But really, what I'm more interested in it just making sense is that I can see that there's something in it for me. Right? I'm not saying that human beings are all selfish. I'm an economist by training, and I like looking at incentives. Believe that this is quite important. But of course, most people are interested in what's in it for them. Why wouldn't they be? Of course, they should be. So we're hoping that the role of the manager, or the manager plays a role where they're proactively translating this important, complex, strategic information to something relevant, useful, and selfishly interesting for the individual in the team. It's quite a hope in many organizations. Why? Because most managers don't understand it themselves. So again, when it comes to this, and this is quite confronting for a manager, for many managers, is to what extent could you go out of your way? And of course, you've got busy schedules. There's not like you're looking at your diary over the next month or two and saying, you know what, I've got days that are totally empty. Maybe I should go and spend some more time with an exec and find out about what's going on with the strategy. This isn't usual behavior for most managers because the diary is really full. But it might be something that we could proactively plan for. And it might be the next 3 to 4 months that we're going to take some time out. We're going to do a better job of understanding what the strategy is. Maybe there's a chance I could get a conversation with our CFO or with the CEO or the CMO or the CHRO or the CTO. Lots of C's, lots of letters, lots of O's. There's lots of senior people in the organization who in theory should understand the strategy better than you do as a manager. And to what extent can we try and spend some time to understand that better? Why that's important? Well, because of course, what we're trying to then do is translate that into a very simple and selfishly focused direction and conversation for the individuals in the team. Why is that important? Well, because most people don't cope very well with ambiguity. Why is that important? Well, because the extent to which we can know stuff means that we feel safer. Why is that important? Because psychological safety is key. We got there. So again, the link here is how do we make sure that people do feel safe, and you feel safer in environments where you feel like other people know what's going on. And therefore, if I know that this is the plan, I know this is the strategy, I know this is where the investment's going to be placed, I know this is where the effort should go, I know this is where the energy is, it's much easier to align my goals, my next 3 to 6 month development plan. And it's more likely if it's aligned to the goals of the organization and it requires an investment business case for it, it's probably going to get signed off and get agreed because it absolutely matches what we're aiming to do. The key interesting thing I found is if I talk to CEOs and say, right, let me at the frontline employees here, give me some frontline development plans. So what we try and do is anonymize frontline employee development plans, and I like to read some of them. And often when you show those to a CEO, most CEOs would say, what the hell are they doing? This has no relationship to where I thought we'd been clear about where we're going. I thought we told everyone we're going left, and everyone says, which way are we going? So we know that there is a translation engine problem. And the translation engine, of course, is me. It's the manager. It's you. It's the manager. We play that key role in translating all this clever stuff into something relevant, useful, selfishly interesting for the individuals in the team. So when it comes to this, in a way of solving this clarity of direction, this is all about good, regular, strategic conversations. Sounds simple, which it actually is, but it requires that we do put the investment of time in order to understand that stuff. And then the last one, which is really important, I think, which is then looking at what we would call isolation and loneliness. Now, again, really sad. This was through the middle of like lockdown. There's a company we work with, and I met a lady who worked. This is like one of the saddest lockdown stories I'd heard, and I heard quite a few. She works in customer complaints for this organization, and she doesn't earn very much. She lives in a what we call in the UK a bedsit. So this is essentially a very small studio apartment. You can't even really call it a studio. It's smaller than a studio apartment. She has a bed. She has maybe like a sink, a place to maybe make a little bit of food, and she has a shared bathroom with other people that live in the house. Of course, if you are in one of these big metropolitan areas like London, like New York, like Dubai, like Singapore, of course, you'll understand that the cost of living is unbelievably high. So she's not earning much money. She lives in a bedsit. She's now working fully remote, dealing with customer complaints for about 8 to 9 hours per day. And she said to me, and this was the most harrowing part of the conversation, she said that she sits at the end of her bed, on the end of her bed, because she doesn't have enough space to have a desk in the room. And she's essentially being shouted at for 8 to 9 hours per day by dealing with customer complaints. And she said to me that the hardest bit is that when the call ends and someone's been quite horrible and you've had to work really hard to try and resolve that conversation, you're just there in silence in the room. It's just you. And I just thought that was one of the most harrowing things, just thinking how many times through the day is she going through this? And then at the end of the day, when the calls are done, unless she's got a really excellent manager, which she didn't, by the way, which is part of the conversation we had, then she's just there. I mean, it is one of the most sort of psychologically damaging things it must be in some of the roles that people are playing on a remote basis, dealing with some really difficult customer and client issues all day long. Without the support of someone or the team or a manager, this can be an awful place to be. So I think that's an extreme case, which I hope most people aren't in, but there are going to be a lot of people in this situation. How do we help to solve this isolation and loneliness issue? And I think a huge thing is to do with what I would call like, it's kind of like the glue, if I was to find a technical term for it. It's the glue. It's not the structured stuff, because we can have set play pieces, as we would say in sport, right? You know that there's a quarterly one-to-one or a half-yearly one-to-one. There's an employee survey that happens. There's a regular team briefing that happens. There's a team catch-up. There could be like some sort of team quiz thing. I don't know. But it might be that those are the set play pieces. The stuff that creates that more relational moment between individuals as human beings, as it would naturally happen in a face-to-face office, right? I can walk outside the door, bump into people and have sporadic, unplanned conversations. And it's what you would call that sort of social capital. It's that glue that binds the whole thing together. That is possible to create virtually. Of course it is with remote team, but it means that we as managers have to work quite hard to ensure that we're doing that. And that could be a funny thing that we're going to send to someone on WhatsApp, or something that they would enjoy learning about, again based on my first point, going all the way back to point one, which is to what extent do we understand the individuals. And it might be that some people are unbelievably resilient. They've got a natural capacity to cope with the difficulties of working in this way, and in a way kind of thrive on it. We know this from talking, we did some work with Oxford University. I mean, it was some unbelievable professors learning about happiness, mindfulness, and we found out from one of the professors' research that actually some people don't have any issue to do at all with this. In a way, they kind of thrive in such an environment. But for those who don't, of course, there are many things that we as a manager can do to try and make an impact on that. So 6 big things I wanted to cover, 6 practical how-tos. I hope those have been of massive value. Let's hang out for a few minutes and see if there are any questions. If so, then please feel free to submit them, and Rose can send them through to us and we can answer those live on the line. For those of you who we can't solve those or answer those questions, because it might be too complex for me too, is that we can maybe try and come back to you offline and have that conversation in another mechanism. So a question here from KP: how do you approach the cultural differences of management styles, as it's very different in APAC to Middle East to US to Europe? I absolutely agree, KP. Perfect point, and it's something that we encounter all the time. I think the extent to which we can deal with those cultural differences, of course, for us as a manager, which again is putting the emphasis and the ownership back on me, this is my problem to deal with, is the extent to which I can understand what those cultural differences are and be really careful and be sympathetic to those challenges of how I might deal with different people from different cultures. One of the things that we were working back and forth in Vietnam before lockdown, actually, with a company, with a client of ours there. And we'd realized after about 3 hours of asking questions to a group and kind of getting zero feedback that we were doing it in totally the wrong way. The manager pulled us aside at lunchtime and said, the way that you're interacting with the team, thank God we had this guy there who said, this is totally wrong. People are not going to respond to you because of the way that you're doing what you're doing. And we changed that over lunch. And in the afternoon, we had a fantastic time. But it was all about being culturally sensitive. And again, something that I might feel is silly or not that important or a bit weird. Of course it isn't, because for someone else it's fundamentally important. The challenge, of course, with all of this, the cultural differences of management styles, is for us as managers to try and be as well educated as possible. One of the things that I would sort of advocate for in the recent version of ChatGPT, which is ChatGPT 4.0, I think it's called, if you're not familiar with it, it has a chat function that you can actually talk back and forth to it using voice. It's unbelievably powerful. And this thing is so good that it's able to give you insights on all this sorts of stuff. So I think in the world we're in now with the tech that's available, again, we can educate ourselves really rapidly. Even though I've never been, I may never have been to Nepal or been to Argentina, I can rapidly educate myself in terms of some of the basics here. Great question, KP. Thanks so much. Any other questions? Any other questions? From Scott D. I'm reading this as you read it, so apologies for the lack of brevity here. How can we keep forming a sense of connection but balance the general message that our organization is remote / hybrid? We don't want to sell our organization falsely where people think hybrid means 2 days in the office. Then they get a shock when most people are at home, as we have no strict rule. I think this is really important, Scott, because the landscape is moving and shifting all the time. I've spent the last 2 days, which has been great for me because usually I'm like doing stuff like this, but I have the opportunity for the last 2 days to do some real face-to-face work with a client of ours. So I've been with the exec team for the last 2 days here in the UK. And one of the things that we talked a lot about for many different guises was an opportunity, this is a practical how-to, Scott, of how we could essentially re-induct the organization. We learned this from part of the Ministry of Defence. And this is one of the best things I've ever seen, actually. One of the things is that they've got lots of contractors they work with. And of course, in many different industries, tech included, the landscape shifts and moves all the time. You can't assume that when you inducted someone into the organization 2023, it's the same as it is in September 2024. The world changes rapidly for some organizations. So we were talking about the case for a reinduction of sorts, taking the entire management population and resetting the expectations of what's expected of you now as a manager, and also what we think would be needed, and also an opportunity for managers to share their fresh concerns. So I do wonder whether, Scott, it could be an opportunity to reinduct not just the managers, but you could really paint a case for the entire organization to reset the expectations and understanding. And maybe that's something that's done on a regular basis, either through the induction process, assuming you've got a solid induction process, or through any other mechanisms where you can get those messages to people. But I think resetting the expectations of what's expected of great managers in September 2024 moving forward can only be a great thing to do. And I think we've got time. We'll take one more question. So if there is one more, please do shout out, and then I can give you some info on the next session. Okay, so we've got Sylvia here. And how do you keep the team motivated with regards to career aspirations when you're in a relatively small organization, 120 employees, where opportunities are few and far between? I think this is, again, an awesome question, Sylvia. This is the challenge for nearly every organization. I want to scale up. Let me scale up big, and I'll come back to your organization of 120. An organization that we work with that's got 50,000 people. So let's look at ultra big organization. We looked at this company and we were interested. The reason why I was interested was because we'd heard a problem about the leaving issue. So lots of people were leaving the company. About 20% of their employee workforce turns over every year. So of the 50,000 people they have, they lose 11,000 people every year. Now imagine the challenge of replacing 11,000 roles every year. I don't know what type of role you're in, Sylvia, but if you were in the HR world, horrific, replacing 11,000 people every year. What we then did is we looked at the leaver data, because they're exceptional at capturing why people are leaving the organization. Not very good at keeping them there, but they're great at capturing the data. We looked at the leaver data. Fascinating. Of the 11,000 people, 5,500 of those 11,000 people left the organization because they didn't feel that there were good enough opportunities for growth and development. My mind was blown, Sylvia, because how could it be in an organization of 50,000 people that you could say that there were limited opportunities to learn and grow in the organization? It's impossible, right? It's totally impossible. We knew it was nothing to do with the organization, and they're a big, quite wealthy organization. It was nothing to do with budget constraints either. It was everything to do with the lack of the poor nature of management conversations that happened or didn't happen on a regular basis with the team. Nothing to do with anything else. So again, I'm yet to find an organization super large or super small. And we went with many organizations much smaller than 120 people who don't have an issue with this, even though there are, of course, limited opportunities for promotion. We're not talking about that, because an organization can only be structured in a certain way. And if it's a certain size, you can't change that. It's like the laws of nature in a way. What we can change are the conversations that managers have about accessing opportunities to learn, grow, and develop from other parts of the organization. And there are all sorts of learning mechanisms that can be put in place where people feel like they're being enriched and they're grown. I think the key is that you're going to have a population of people, let's assume it's 10 to 15 tops, I'd say 20% of the population, who will go out of their way and do more than the average and go the extra mile to learn things that most other people probably wouldn't. So there's that population or cohort that you probably want to spend a disproportionate amount of time with. The others kind of here nor there, and many people are quite happy to just do a good job, and that's enough for them. Thank you very much. So I guess I don't think it's probably 120. You've got a smaller cohort of people that you probably need to spend a disproportionate amount of time with, and therefore I would start to look at how you could create opportunities to learn, grow, and develop based on what the organization does. I would imagine you've got a CEO and a CFO and a CMO and or head of HR. There's going to be all sorts of key positions where learning could be driven out from to educate and create a program for individuals that feel like they can grow. And if, unfortunately, like the quote we always see on LinkedIn, if that means that I should develop employees and they leave, much better than we don't develop people and they stay and get frustrated and fester and hack off the rest of the culture. So that said, thank you very much, Sylvia. And again, huge thank you for those of you who've been dialing in for the session. As I said, we're going to run these now every month. The next one is going to be in October. We're actually going to send out a communication on LinkedIn and other platforms tomorrow morning, and we're going to host it in October. That one's probably going to be live from Croatia, I think. We'll try and do them in different locations as we move around. And we're going to get into a really important topical issue for you personally. And the topic is called how to get paid more, right? This is all about how do we better realize our individual value as a person. And we're going to look at some key ways that we can improve, in a way, our chances of pay and promotions. I think in a world where we're dealing with a cost of living crisis and all the challenges we're dealing with, people, and there's evidence to suggest that people are more hesitant with moving jobs for obvious reason. If we are in the organization, how can we maximize the value that we're getting for ourselves, for our teams, and of course for the organizations as well? So a huge thank you for everyone dialing in. A huge thank you to Rose from our team and the rest of our team that are dialing in, I'm sure. Massive shout out to everyone around the world who've dialed into the session, and we look forward to seeing you again, of course, in November. Thanks all. Bye-bye.